Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. How are you? I'm OGS Deputy Commissioner Dan Cunningham, and on behalf of Roanne DeStito, Commissioner of the New York State Office of General Services, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this evening's event, The Bandleader Who Changed America, a musical journey through the life of James Reese, Europe. This program is being offered in conjunction with our current exhibition, Their Glory Can Never Fade, the Legacy of the Harlem Hellfighters, located at the Vietnam Memorial Gallery at the Robert Abrams Building for Law and Justice. If you haven't had a chance to visit and walk through the gallery and the exhibit, I'd encourage you to do so. It's a wonderful tribute to the 369th and its members, whose impact was felt far beyond the battlefield. OGS is pleased to offer these free programs and events to the community, which highlight our rich and diverse history and tell compelling stories of New Yorkers, everyday New Yorkers, who have made an impact on society, especially those who have served our country and their families and left an indelible legacy in the history of New York State. But like any of these types of programs or events, they don't happen on their own. It takes a collaborative team effort. So let me just take a moment to recognize the many friends and partners who've made this evening possible, including the 369th Veterans Association, the New York State Division of Veterans Affairs, New York University, the State University of New York, the EGG, the Empire State Plaza Performing Arts Center, our wonderful hosts for this evening. Team OGS, particularly the staff of our curatorial and visitor services and special events groups, who do a tremendous job putting programs and events like these together. And our distinguished panelists, who are generously offering their time, talent, and knowledge with us this evening. Let's give them a round of applause. And of course, this evening's program sponsor, J-Dog Junk Removal and Hauling, whose generous support has made this evening possible. J-Dog is a local veteran-owned business who proudly supports programs that recognize those who have served this country and their armed forces and their families, who sacrifice so much so that we may enjoy the freedoms so often taken for granted. Please join me in welcoming J-Dog brand ambassador, Scott Galarno. Scott.
Okay, good evening, everyone. My name is Scott Galarno. I am the brand ambassador for J-Dog Junk Removal and Hauling. J-Dog is a company that prides itself in supporting veterans and military families by empowering them through entrepreneurship. It is a way for us to continue service to our country and our communities. In the same way, we are happy to support this program, which highlights the story of James Reese, Europe, a soldier and a leader who not only served his country proudly, but continued to inspire individuals after his military career as a veteran of the armed forces. J-Dog is honored to be part of such a distinguished event tonight. My company thanks you for this opportunity and enjoy the presentation. Thank you very much.
American officers were so impressed with Europe's unique sound that they sent the band on a tour of army camps and French villages. They played French and American marches, plantation melodies, and the song Europe had made famous, the Memphis Blues. With a soul-rousing crash of cymbals, cornet and clarinet players began to manipulate notes in that typical rhythm which no artist has ever put down on paper. Then, as the drummers struck their stride, their shoulders shaking in time, the audience could stand it no longer. The jazz germ hit them, and it seemed to find the vital spot, loosening all muscles and causing what is known in American as an eagle rocking it.
soldier, a musician, a composer, a charismatic personality, a natural leader. He was called the first lieutenant of jazz. Some called him the father of jazz. U.B. Blake called him the Martin Luther King of music. He was fearless, he was outspoken, but most of all, he was highly respected by people of all color. James Reese Europe was the band leader who changed America. My name is Joe Madeira, and I'm very happy to have you all here tonight. I'm the Director of Curatorial and Visitor Services for the Office of General Services. We have a very special evening tonight. We're presenting a program that combines a little bit of history, a little bit of music, some incredible images and video, as you've already seen, and one powerful story about a phenomenal individual. An individual whose story is less known, maybe forgotten by some, and maybe overlooked by others. It's a story of a musical genius and a compelling leader whose life was tragically cut short at the very height of his career. So tonight, we're going to take you on a journey back in time to a time of war and patriotism, to a time of ragtime and early jazz, and to a time when discrimination and injustices kept talented and fearless individuals from rising, from succeeding, from gaining the credit and respect they deserved because of the color of their skin. And in this specific time rose a true hero, a hero who set out to change perceptions of African Americans as soldiers, as musicians, as human beings. A hero who changed America. A hero whose story is so inspiring, perhaps we all here tonight can have a role remembering, honoring, perhaps retelling this forgotten story in order to continue this legacy of change. And we have invited 3 special guests tonight to lead you on this journey. We have Dean Emeritus of the School of Music at SUNY Schenectady and founder and music director of the Empire Jazz Orchestra. A trombonist and conductor, he has performed with acclaimed symphonies and notable artists such as Manhattan Transfer, Yes, Aretha Franklin, Rosemary Clooney, and Johnny Mathis. Please welcome to the stage Bill Meckley. All the way from New York City. We have Associate Professor of Dramatic Writing at NYU's Gallatin School of Individualized Study. In addition to teaching cultural studies, ragtime music, dramatic writing, and African American history, he dedicates an entire course to James Reese Europe called James Reese Europe in American Music. Please welcome Michael Dinwiddie. And a special treat tonight, and a special guest. Many here have heard him perform in the greater capital region. A very talented pianist and music educator, he has performed with ensembles such as Rumba Nama, the Boston Latin Band, the Big Soul Ensemble, and the Empire Jazz Orchestra. Please welcome Mr. David Gleason.
You're going to start us off, Bill.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you, Joe.
Little background music for you. Thank you.
Little traveling tune here. I wanted to thank everybody and just let you know how honored I am to be part of this really special occasion. when you came in, those of you who came in a few minutes earlier, you may have noticed, and I'm sure many of you did, that we were listening to the music of Duke Ellington, perhaps the most significant, important artist that America's yet produced. And we're here tonight to celebrate the legacy and story of another great artist who unfortunately kind of fell under the radar due to several different circumstances. And we're just very happy to try to help you understand this story, and as Joe said, to go tell the story when you leave here. I'm going to try to put this in a little bit of context first, and I do promise that we will get back to James Reese Europe. But I wanted to talk a little bit about where American music was at the end of the 19th century and in the early 20th century. American music was this kind of really interesting bubbling stew of stuff. And people in the academy, people in the universities were wondering, what is American art music going to be? What is the American classical music going to be? Where is it going to come from? And of course, there were composers writing music very much in the European tradition that they'd been trained. But that was not going to be the American music. That was not going to be the music that we now think of as our true art. And so what we see is the development of especially African-American styles of music that are pretty regionally separated. In the rural South, we have the development of the blues, a form that has its own kind of tonal structure. It has a specific system of harmony that it likes to use, a certain tonality to the scales. We had dances coming about, social dancing becoming increasingly popular. We had spirituals. We had the music of the church, and the development of a new style called ragtime. All of these slowly began to meld as musicians from one part of the country heard other musicians do it. Ragtime had a real advantage because ragtime music was being published. You could go out and buy a Scott Joplin rag. And the term ragtime itself was pretty widely applied to a lot of music. There were what we think of as the classic ragtime, that is the music of Scott Joplin and others, who were notating very specifically what they wanted to play. But other forms of looser type jazz music that kind of started to lean toward jazz began to be labeled ragtime. What we begin to see with especially black musicians is the melding of elements of the European tradition with the African music traditions. This could only happen in America. This is what eventually evolves into early jazz. There's nothing like jazz in Europe. There's really nothing like jazz in Africa. From Europe, we have a very highly developed system of harmony, of functional harmony, where chords have jobs. This chord will proceed to this chord. The instruments are of European origin. Musicians coupled that with African traditions, sometimes filtered through Caribbean music and musicians, of complex polyrhythm, layers and layers of rhythm on top of each other, of vocal traditions where it was, unlike European singing, was very acceptable to bend a pitch, to kind of sing between the notes. Also, the idea that as a classical musician, you're trained to have an idealized sound. You know, if you're going to be an opera singer, you need to sound like opera singers. But in that tradition, the individual's voice is very much appreciated. That's why Dizzy Gillespie doesn't sound like Miles Davis. And when we hear, Charlie Parker play, we know that's Charlie Parker by his sound. So these are the coupling of these traditions really lead to something pretty cool starting to happening. and that is the development of a true American music art form. One of the things that's interesting as composers began to take these elements from what were essentially folk roots, blues, from spirituals and that kind of thing, and incorporating in these compositions was that there's kind of a corollary between what was going on in Europe in the 19th century when nationalism became, the rage, as the large empires broke up and small countries began to exert their pride in their art forms. So you had composers like Dvorak and Smetana, who were Chopin, who were all taking parts of their national heritage and putting it into their classical music. This becomes a really important component in American art music. I'm going to ask David here, our wonderful pianist, to talk a little bit and to demonstrate two of these I believe, the two most important forms that begin to meld together for this American music, and that's blues and ragtime. So, David?
Good evening, everyone. I want to thank you for allowing me to be part of this event tonight. It's such an honor to be up here with these folks and to be talking about such an important figure in American history and American music. I have a few examples to illustrate the kinds of things that Dr. Meckley is talking about. I have this example of an imagining of what the blues would have sounded like in the pre-recorded era. It's what we call barrel house blues, where the left hand of the piano just pulses. And I'm going to take this example, I call it the Texarkana Stomp. I'm going to also play it in the style of W.C. Handy, where it will have more of a ragtime oompa or stomp or stride feel, more of a march feel. So I'll play this example twice, and first you'll hear it as a traditional blues, and then as a ragtime blues, if you will. Thank you. The second example is meant to illustrate ragtime. This is probably the most famous rag, and it's Scott Joplin's Entertainer. And it was written in 1902, or at least published in 1902. And I'm only going to play the first section because it's a rather lengthy piece with many parts to it. I'm going to play the first section. And the first time I play it, I'm going to play it as a traditional ragtime composition would be played. You're going to hear straight eighth notes. You're going to hear syncopation. I think Bill talked a little bit about syncopation. If the melody wasn't syncopated or given an offbeat feel, so it is syncopated. If you could imagine what it would be like if it wasn't syncopated, it might be something like. There really would be very little to it.
That would be how I would play
That's
it.
how you would. You're also going to hear what I call American chromaticism, the way the piano interprets the blue notes. I mean, we can't really bend the notes, but you can use them as you pass to other notes. You hear that quite a lot in American music. You're going to hear the oompa, stomping, marching, stride, left hand, and the syncopation we talked about. The second time I'm going to play it as it's clear that some musicians were interpreting this music with a lilting feel, with a swinging feel, with different articulations, with different interpretations of the music, with different accents, and with more freedom. So first time, strictly ragtime. Second time, something approaching a swing or a jazz feel.
Yeah, there's an awful lot to deconstruct there, and we have these elements that are starting to come together. We have the blues feel, not only the blues form, but the blues tonality, the syncopation of the ragtime. And ragtime became amazingly popular for dancing, for playing, and of course, the writers in the newspapers were saying, this is the end of civilization, This is, it was like when rock and roll came out in the 50s. This is absolutely going to destroy our youth. And the last element that David just did, the idea of swing. The reinterpretation, and this is the part that falls on the performer. The reinterpretation of the rhythm, the kind of softening of that ragtime from kind of the da da do da oo da oo da oo da, kind of that rounding off of the rhythm. The swing element becomes probably the most vital component in American jazz. Also, I can tell you from many years of experience, one of the hardest to teach. But I'll give you an example. I know many of you would be familiar with the Count Basie Band. To me, the most swinging band of all time. You could take the music for a Count Basie tune, a Count Basie chart, and put it in front of musicians and say, play it exactly as it's written. And it won't sound anything like Count Basie. It will just be bizarre. But the rhythmic notation that in front of the musicians shows square, even eighth notes. But musicians who are trained in the jazz tradition know to do that. Now I'm going to try to bring us back to James Reese Europe, because we're going to listen to a recording that I think demonstrates all of this. And this was a recording done in 1919. His band had been playing this for several years before this, but this was when they finally made a recording. And it's a recording of Memphis Blues. And this has...
You want me to stop it? I'll stop. Go
Oh,
on, talk.
man.
Talk, man. We're ready
Can't
for
wait
the
to
blues.
hear it.
Exactly. Go on. Talk.
I just want to give you a little context because this has some really interesting stuff in it. It has blues forms, both 12-bar and 16-bar blues. It has basic ragtime rhythm, but just as Dave played in The Entertainer the second time, it's slightly rounded off, okay? It's not jagged. And remember, this is like a 60-piece band playing this. So to get 60 musicians to do anything together, is so it really speaks to his ability as a leader and an interpreter, conductor. And it's based on a two-beat kind of a march, or in New Orleans, what would be called a stomp feel, which was in a million cartoons. You remember all the cartoons of the boom, 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 boom. So the stomp. And to me, one of the most fascinating things is, especially toward the end, there are a series of breaks in the music. where the band essentially stops and either a very small ensemble or a soloist plays a break, which I suspect are improvised. This was a real component that we hear a lot in early New Orleans music. Early jazz was an ensemble music. It wasn't the soloist music that we think of. It wasn't until Louis Armstrong and Sidney Bechet, who were such monumental soloists that they just wrenched the music in a new direction. But this music, this recording has all of these components in 1919 of what becomes the great American art form in early jazz. So this is just so much fun and amazing to listen to. This is Memphis Blues.
Thanks.
David and I were talking out in the hall before the presentation, and I have taught jazz history for many years, and David is very versed in jazz history. And one of the things I'd always tell the students before I'd play recordings like this is you have to remember, at that time, these were the hippest cats. Okay, these were the John Coltrane's of their time. Now, there wasn't this was not old music. This was pushing the envelope. And I think when you hear, because that was James Reese Europe's arrangement, you hear this astounding talent who, because of a lot of circumstance, and Michael's going to talk about this, kind of got under our radar. But he deserves to be spoken of in the same conversation with Jelly Roll Morton and Fletcher Henderson and Duke Ellington and Charles Mingus. And that he and those musicians are what gave us what is really American music. And so I'm going to turn this over to Michael.
Thanks, Bill. That was a really great introduction to get started. Good evening. Sitting here thinking about it, I'm looking at we have a little monitor here, and I'm looking at the Pathé Frères phonograph company, but it says for U.S. consumption only, which is fascinating, and then it's a foxtrot, which means it's a dance, and then it's Handy, W.C. Handy. And so the story is that this is really when James Reese Europe heard this, he arranged it for the castles. We'll be talking about Irene and Vernon Castle later, but it's really fascinating that French Pathé Frères, and it's also, this is the kind of music these are called race records. The music was released specifically by African Americans for our African American audience, and as you know later, become very popular. Mamie Smith, Bessie Smith, all those singers. James Reese Europe he became a New Yorker by adoption, but he was born in Mobile, Alabama. And what's fascinating about that is Mobile had an incredible tradition of marching bands. They had Mardi Gras, like New Orleans as well. And he was born in 1880, February 22nd, 1880. His father, Henry, had been born into slavery in 1847, but his mother, Lorraine, was born into a family that had been free for a couple of generations. And I just have to tell you, Europe was his real family name. He didn't create that as his, it wasn't Cardi B or something like that. His mother was a school teacher, and when she married Henry, they had 4 children, and their children were Ida, John, James, and Mary. Now, 3 of them would become musicians, and that's really understandable when you realize that the mother played piano, and she also read music, and the father was a musician as well. James' first instrument that he really loved was the violin. That was his, call it the fiddle if you want, but he loved that. His father played the fiddle as well. In 1872, his father, and this is after Reconstruction, this is the 1870s in the South. African Americans have just come out of slavery, and there's a real progressive feeling in the country. And his father was actually appointed to a clerkship in the U.S. Post Office there and later worked for the Internal Revenue, which is in the news these days. And he also wrote for the newspaper in Alabama, and he also was a minister, a pastor of a church. So it was upwardly mobile family, quote, cultivated, end of quote, meaning that they had education. He was growing up in a family with middle-class aspirations, which was a middle-class family at the time. And in 1889, James Reese Europe's father had an opportunity to move to Washington, D.C., and to work with the National Postal Service. And it's important that we note that the U.S. Postmaster General was Rodman Wanamaker. You know that name, the department store? Remember that family? Well, this is Rodman Wanamaker, who was at that time. And the name's going to come back again. So Henry, his father, enrolled at Howard University, studied law. James and his sister and his brother played music. And in fact, on their block, and this is interesting in the period in the history too, because this is the time before the rigid segregation that comes with Jim Crow. So on his block that they lived in Washington, D.C., John Philip Sousa moved on the block, the same block, the great band leader, the great musician. And Sousa had an incredibly warm relationship with the African-American community. His band would play for Howard University's commencement services, and they would play for churches and concerts out in Washington, D.C. And also, he was very much interested in having American young people learn music. That was really part of his goal. And so his assistant conductor, a guy named Enrico Hurley, actually taught James Reese Europe and his sister Mary music. One of the things that's interesting about this period is this music that James Reese Europe loved and that he played was not considered respectable. Ragtime music had really come out of bordellos, and it was music that was disreputable. It was not, many of the musicians could not read music, so the idea was that somehow this wasn't as, at a level of musicianship. And Scott Joplin talks about the fact that he went around and collected the folk music that he heard, and that's what he wrote down. Those were the songs. So it was kind of American folk music, and as you know, we Americans have a very strange notion about our own culture. We kind of aren't sure what about it is to be represented in the world, basically. So, but Enrico Hurley taught James, and James's sister Mary became a really important musician. She played the music. She became the music teacher at a school called the M Street School, which was the outstanding school in Washington, D.C. for African Americans. And James went to school there. He actually went to school there. But a really sad thing happened when he was 19 years old. His father died. And so when his father died in 1899, James, his mother, who had worked for 30 years, she'd been a homemaker and housekeeper at home, they had to figure out what to do to go to work. So the older sister, Ida, had gone to teacher's college, and she went and became a teacher. Mary, as I said, became an accompanist at M Street School. John, the older brother, moved to New York to become a musician, and later James came after. And at first, James was playing the violin, the fiddle. That was his instrument, but nobody wanted to hear the fiddle. Not in a nightclub, you know, I mean, not in the restaurants or anything like that. So he switched over to the piano, and he started to become very successful. He played in nightclubs in Harlem. This is the time when African Americans are migrating to the north. Harlem's becoming a center of African American culture. And there's a great story that he played in one bar, one nightclub, and there was a kid who couldn't get in, who sat outside listening to him. The kid's name was George Gershwin. So James Europe always said he got his real training in African American musical theater. Now, in the 1890s and up to 1900, African American, these are the Frogs. This is a group called the Frogs. I love that name because James Reese Europe is actually, I have to look around. He's on the right side. He's the second from the left up there. That's James Reese Europe. And standing next to him is Bert Williams. Bert Williams was a very famous vaudevillian with Williams and Walker. And these gentlemen, you see how they're dressed, very elegant, very presenting themselves in a way that's very respectable. Because people didn't think of entertainers as being respectable. They thought of entertainers as being people who were on the road, who were, well, we know what people thought of entertainers. But anyway,
We know.
I was gonna say, we still kind of deal with that. But so part of what they wanted to do was create a notion of African American entertainers as being very classy, being elegant, and being men of stature instead of men who were thought of as, you know, just fly-by-night artists. And this is for all musicians, really.
I think that culture that they established was very much the culture that Duke Ellington felt that was so important to him.
You think of those band leaders, they're dressed up, they're elegant,
Yeah,
they make sure
absolutely.
they're on time, they're doing all those things. So you can see this picture of James Reese Europe with his musicians as well. And he began his ascent in what was African American musical theater, on the road, doing different shows in Dahomey, shows like Shoe Fly Regiment, and they were shows that presented stories of African Americans that were positive stories. So an African American soldier, there were love stories. This was part of what they thought was really important in terms of creating a different image, because this is the era of minstrelsy. Remember, this is the era when we have many entertainers on stage wearing blackface. This is his sister. There are no images of his parents. This is Mary, his sister, his baby sister, who became herself a really famous musician who accompanied classical artists when they came here. Coleridge Taylor Perkins, yes, he was one of the guys that she worked with. Kyrie Gaunt's here. She's going to correct me for that, I hope, because I can't think of his name, but you'll give it to me. He realized that African American musicians were thought of as people who come and work and play the music, but they also were supposed to clean up after. They were supposed to wait the tables. They were doing all these things. And so he said, wait a minute, this is not the way to treat musicians. So in 1910, he organized something called the Clef Club. And now, so it's interesting because in DC there was the Treble Club. And so he organized the Clef Club. And the idea was, these are musicians. If you hire them, they are guaranteed a certain amount of payment. They are also going to be treated with dignity. They're going to not be asked to do anything but what they're hired to do. And he organized this group, and they actually came together. There were 100 musicians at a point. They ended up buying a clubhouse. First they were downtown in the 50s in New York City, the West 50s, and then they bought a place up in Harlem. And the whole idea of the Clef Club was it was like a union, because remember, this is a period when African Americans could not join unions. So when I was in Kansas City talking about this, I went to, there was a African American union there of musicians. And Detroit, where I'm from, again, there were separate unions. I won't say separate but equal, but they were definitely separate. And the African American musicians organized themselves. James Reese Europe, again, wanted to create a notion of respectability for African American musicians. So what he decided to do with a guy named David Manis was they decided to have a concert at Carnegie Hall in 1912. This is the first of the concerts. It's kind of ragtime. But what's fun is that there were 10 pianos on stage, and the musicianship was totally different. And the way he did it was he put the different sections together, because there were some guys who could read and some who couldn't, so they taught the music to each other. So this kind of really fantastic sound at Carnegie Hall, if you can imagine it, even though the subway rumbles through sometimes there. And it was so popular and so beloved. And the idea was to raise money for the Colored Music School. David Manis, who becomes a very important band leader in New York, had been taught by an African-American violinist. And so he wanted to give something back to the African-American community, so he and James Reese Europe came together to have these concerts. And it was 1912 they did one, 1913 they did one, 1914 as well. Always sold out, always really popular. But then World War I comes around. And before World War I, though, James Reese Europe was heard by a guy named Vernon Castle. Vernon and Irene Castle were the people who popularized dance in America. Remember, this is a country where dance is not, we don't dance, puritanical, and it's evil and it brings the devil. I know some of us have grandparents who can tell those stories. Or some parents, I don't know. But the Castles were a young couple, and they were considered clean-cut and nice and friendly. And so they had started dancing in Europe, and they came, and they were a sensation in the US. They made a fortune, they traveled the country, but they couldn't get, everywhere they went, they got bands that sounded different. And so it was very upsetting to them. So Vernon heard James Reese Europe's band, the Clef Club group, and he said, I really want to work with you forever. I want you guys to be my band. So in this era, when very few black-white organizations worked together, James Reese Europe came to work with the Castles in their music. There's one thing I need to talk about that I missed, which is really important. That James Reese Europe, when he wasn't performing with his big groups, he would perform for society functions. The Wanamaker's hired him for a birthday party, and from that party, he ended up playing for the Astors, the Vanderbilts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So his musicians played for the top parties at Newport, Philadelphia, and they were known. People would call the Clef Club to get those musicians. They really wanted to work with them. So that's what James Reese Europe did in his spare time. So you want to talk about the Castles?
Well, I think it just says so much about, especially Vernon Castle, that they saw the advantage, and the primary advantage is let's hire the best person.
Yep.
And so they had this musician with such incredibly high concept of how the music should be played. And you have to also give credit to Vernon and Irene Castle, because especially the foxtrot.
Yeah.
I mean, this was Negro music that was not to be, and frankly, they made it acceptable to the white audiences. And the idea, I mean, there was kind of this myth in the jazz world that Benny Goodman was the first person to really have an integrated jazz organization, but here we have many, many years before that, and God bless Benny Goodman, but it's just the idea of, like, let's hire the best the best musicians we can. And James Reese Europe was the pinnacle at that time. And we have a short clip. Now, this is from 1915, so this is pretty rough video.
Yeah.
But you can see just how scandalous this dancing is.
It's okay that we show that?
Oh, I know.
Okay,
It's-
wow, I
it's,
don't know. Wow.
Please, I hope nobody fainted.
Yes, exactly.
Anyway, the point is that here was Vernon and Irene Castle were visionaries, and looking past any other divisions other than, like, let's get the best musician we can possibly get. Now, Dave is going to play a piece that was written for the Castles by James Reese Europe. So, Dave, why don't you talk a little bit?
It's called Castle House Rag, and it's described as a trot and one step from 1914.
The foxtrot was especially.
Yeah.
It has the ragtime feel that we've talked about. This is the bass line for it. has the swinging feel. If it were interpreted the way it's written here, it would sound like this. But it's not. So it has that going for it. And it also has some other very interesting musical features that show off James Reese Europe's compositional style and just how sophisticated it was. First of all, this is a condensed score. This would have been for a full band, so there was orchestration that he dealt with that he does masterfully, and you can hear that in like the Memphis Blues recording or the Castle Walk, which we just heard. I'm going to skip the repeats because it's rather lengthy, and when you play for dancers, of course, you need more music so that to fit with what the dancers are doing in terms of their choreography. But it has a number of sections in it, and the first section has, it's not a blues per se, but it has some blues elements in it. We talked about the swing and the feel, but much like a blues, although it doesn't go to all the right chords at the right time to be a 12-bar blues or even a 16-bar blues. It is a 16-bar form, and it has this idea that moves around, moves up, moves down, much like a verse of a blues would. It sounds like this. It does that a couple times, and then it goes. And then it has something different at the end, which is also the introduction. And you can see how those are all related. So it has some of the same shifts as a blues. The second section is much more European in flavor. It takes one idea, and it moves it through a series of chord changes, building to a climax. It's something like a development section, would be called in a European piece of classical music. The final section is what happens in European dance music from the Baroque era, or where you have a minuet and trio, or in a lot of marches, you have a contrasting section called the trio. It's not really for three musicians, it's just a lighter texture, and it sounds like this. All right, so yeah, wait for it, it's coming. There's a few other things I want to highlight in here, and the other thing I really want to highlight is James Reese Europe's absolute mastery of harmony. The chords all flow perfectly, you heard in that section. The very next moment of the piece has this beautiful bass line. And you have this almost Schumann, I'll play that again, Schumann harmonic motion. You also have some great examples of 19th century harmony, the best of. That progression, there's another moment where it sounds almost like Strauss. You don't expect it to go there, but it does. And then you have this omnibus progression. Fancy name, but I'm sure you've heard it quite a lot in music. It's this outward expanding harmony. It almost feels like Beethoven, right? And you have some forward-looking harmony, something that might be out of Debussy or certainly out of the jazz that is to come a decade later, and that is this kind of harmony here. That is a really beautiful chord that you don't expect in a piece of music from 1914. So this is Castle House Rag.
Thanks, David.
Makes you want to dance, doesn't it?
Yeah, just a couple points that David, made. This is amazingly sophisticated music, and this is what I mean by great American art music. Those, the concept of melding that ragtime and moving towards swing rhythm with these incredibly sophisticated harmonies. That's what makes it great American music. And just another point, Wynton Marsalis talks about, somebody once said about Louis Armstrong, said he was an intuitive genius. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean he didn't know what he was doing? No, the grasp of harmony that James Reese Europe demonstrates in that piece is astonishing. I mean, I'm fairly well educated. I couldn't write that with a gun to my head. Like you got 5 years to write something like that. No, couldn't happen. I mean, it's just great music on any level.
When you say that, we talked about this earlier too. James Reese Europe had the advantage of learning European music, but having a culture that really was able to embrace it. And so the polyrhythm of African music, the traditions he had, that he came out of the African American church, all those things that we really still hear in American music today, those are things that are really quite remarkable in terms of their continuation in our culture, continuing to develop and grow. We are now at a point where war has come. War has come to the world. But 1914, war starts in Europe. The United States doesn't enter. But in New York State, there was a kind of notion that in Harlem, which was becoming an African-American community, there was a notion that there should be a National Guard armory and there should be a troop there. And so Bert Williams, this entertainer, a very famous entertainer, spoke to James Reese Europe and said, you should really join this troop. So we're getting ready for war, and it's National Guard, infantry, 15th Infantry is what it's called. The governor of New York creates this 15th Infantry. But they were having a problem. The problem was nobody wanted to join. They didn't want to go to war, I guess. But so Colonel Hayward, who was a white officer, came to James Reese Europe and said, you've joined, we'd really like you to organize a regimental band. And he said, no. I can't possibly do that in the Army. You're too restricted. I cannot possibly create a regimental band because the idea was to march through the streets and get people to come sign up, hear the military music and just get really excited. So Hayward kept asking him, well, what would it take? And so James Reese Europe said, well, if I'm going to do this, I need $10,000. And this is 1917. How much is that worth, you think, today? What's 10,000? It's like $250,000 today, okay? So Hayward, being really ambitious to really build this regiment, went to one of his very wealthy friends, director of U.S. Steel, and said, could you give me the names of 20 people so I can write each one and get $500 from each one? And the guy went over to his desk, opened the desk, pulled out a check, and wrote a check for $10,000. He said, now, there's your 20 people. Now, you don't have to do that, okay? So now James Reese Europe has a problem because his bluff is called, right?
He's actually got
so he's like, okay,
form a band.
So then he says, well, wait a minute, no, I need horn players, but the best horn players are in Puerto Rico. So I have to go to Puerto Rico to get them. And Hayward says, okay, go, it's fine, when you get the guys you want. So he goes to Puerto Rico, he brings back these guys who are hablan español, pero no inglés, es muy interesante, because they're going to come into the U.S. this infantry in Harlem. And then he says, and you know what? Regimental bands are too small. I need 60 players. Otherwise, I can't get the full sound I need. And I need to pay the musicians what they would make outside because they're giving up gigs. And Hayward says, okay, everything you want. So now he's trapped. There's nothing he can do but build a band. And so he builds a regimental band for the 15th Infantry, and it becomes an incredible tool. All of a sudden, they're recruiting, they're marching through the streets of Harlem, and everybody wants to join. It's pretty remarkable. His assistant is a guy named Noble Sissel. That name will come up again, and you will see that too. So World War I has started in Europe, and in 1917, the United States enters the war. Fascinating, just a little side note, Woodrow Wilson, who had campaigned on, he kept us out of the war, didn't declare us war, but also he was a segregationist, so he did not want the troops work together. He did not want them integrated. He didn't want an integrated army. He actually segregated the civil service in Washington, D.C. It had been integrated from the time of the Civil War, but he segregated the bathrooms and wouldn't hire people of color. So, but these guys are like, this is a way for us to prove that we're good Americans. We'll go and we'll fight in this war. We'll be part of the progress in this country. Because there were people, A. Philip Randolph was saying, we shouldn't go to war. Why would we fight an enemy, let them fight each other? But W.E. Du Bois put forth the call and said, please, we need to really do this. So the troops go to training. First they go to Fort Dix in Long Island, where when they got online with the troops, the white troops, there was a riot because the white troops did not want to eat with black soldiers. So they're like, okay, where do we send them? Oh, to train, let's send them to Spartanburg, South Carolina. So in Spartanburg, South Carolina, Noble Sissel, being a New Yorker, went into a hotel through the front door with his hat on, because he was wearing his uniform, and he went to buy a New York Times. The owner of the hotel told him to take his hat off, but he was in military uniform, but he complied. They were told to do what you're told to do. And then the man kicked him out the door. He was walking back. The white soldiers had witnessed this, and they were outraged because they were soldiers, some of them were from the north, and they were gonna march and burn down the hotel, basically. The black soldiers were kind of calm about it because they were like, we understand this, where we are, everything. So James Reese, though, got wind of it, got into a Jeep, halted it, made the soldiers turn around and go back. But Hayward then sent a telegram to Washington, D.C. saying, we can't stay here, send us somewhere else. So they were sent to France. So they were some of the first troops to arrive. And the French at the time were really losing the war. They needed troops very badly. And when the troops first got there, I should have shown, this is the fear of Negro troops in Spartanburg. This is what James looked like in his attire. So when they got there, at first they were doing latrine duty and stuff like that, but they had been trained. James Reese Europe had actually trained with machine guns, and so he was commissioned as a lieutenant. And so he was really, they wanted to be in the war. They didn't want to just go and do, most of the African-American troops that went to the war were the backup troops and doing the things behind the scenes. They were not on the front line. My grandfather was one of those. He tells the story of, the story told in the family was that, it was a really difficult time because all the officers were white. And many of them had never dealt, and they felt that the best people to deal with black soldiers were white Southerners because they knew black people. So it was a very difficult time. He ended up, my aunt tells the story, he ate lye soap so he could get sick and get out. Oh, but he got out okay. Here's a picture of the soldiers that came. And in this picture, this is important, this is James Reese with Noble Sissel, who was his right hand in the band, and we're gonna see him again. So they ended up performing all over France. You want to talk about France and the music in Europe?
Well, I think if there's ever a situation of being in the right place at the right time, taking the band to France. The end of the 19th century, the early part of the 20th century until the start of the war, is sometimes referred to as the Belle Epoque or the beautiful era in France. It was an era where France, and most specifically Paris, became the cultural center of Europe. It's where French music, Debussy, Ravel, became the most important music that was being written. It was where new art forms were being developed. Impressionism in painting had long been established, but they were beginning to break even that boundary, and Impressionism was becoming increasingly important in music. Literature, new styles in literature. So we had a culture, an environment that was very accepting of new things. People were interested to hear things that they hadn't, and see things and read things that they hadn't seen before. Another thing that occurred in 1900 was the Paris Exposition, and a very important component of this was titled the Exhibition of American Negroes. There were exhibits devoted to African American contributions to science, to industry, to engineering, to the arts. There were demonstrations of American-style dances, the foxtrot, the cakewalk, ragtime, People like W.B. Du Bois were there, David Murray, Thomas Callaway. So it was a very kind of eye-opening and educational experience for the people who attended. Created this great opportunity in the midst of tragedy, obviously, in the war. One of the things that we saw after that was European composers began to take some of these elements. People like Stravinsky and Mio and Debussy began to put components of American dance and ragtime and blues tonality in their music. And we were talking earlier today about this, and as a musician who plays classical music quite a bit, I've played a lot of these pieces, and they're fun and they're interesting, but they're very different. The European jazz-influenced music, to me, can't shed itself of the angst that we hear, the kind of, I don't want to call it neuroses, but this kind of foreboding, whereas the American music, and the best term I know, and we have a short clip, Wynton Marsalis talks about jazz as an optimistic music, and it's joyful, and that's what's missing in these kind of European reworkings of American music. We have a very short little piece here. I mean, that's just, that doesn't make you smile. You better go to the ear doctor. In addition to playing for troops and for official Army functions, Europe's band began to play public concerts. And maybe you know the story better than I, but there was one public concert. It was supposed to be a one-night affair.
Can we do it?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, well, basically what happened was they tried to sail. They got on a boat. They fell apart. They had to go back. And then they got on another boat. They were trying to sail to France, and it fell apart again. This time the people on the boat, the army, the guys, fixed the boat so they could get there. They landed in France, and when they got there, they came off the boat, and he assembled the musicians, and they played a song, and we're going to let David take it, right? Yeah. Because I want him to talk about what they did with this song.
Yeah, and again, we spoke about this earlier, the idea of interpretation, the reworking of music, the way that David reworked The Entertainer. This is the French national anthem.
Mm-hmm. So this is La Marseillaise, the French national anthem. I'm going to play it twice. The first time I will play it in my best impression of a military march. And the second time I will play as close as I can with the piano alone to James Reese Europe's reimagining of this piece. And you will hear all the things you might expect to hear from James Reese Europe. You'll hear a more ragtime feel. You'll hear the syncopation. You'll even hear at one point, it's my favorite part, like a Caribbean rhythm here. Right? And you'll hear the jazz articulations. And it quickly becomes something more joyful than the military march.
got to tell them, the French did not recognize it at first. They didn't know what it was. And when they finally did, they just started getting really excited about it.
And they just loved
Exactly.
the band and demanded concert after concert after concert. You know, tonight's title is James Reese Europe, the Bandleader Who Changed America. James Reese Europe, the Bandleader Who Changed Europe.
Right.
You know, and on top of that, again, we have this environment that was so accepting of the music that for many, many years, jazz musicians, especially went to Europe, but especially to France to work and to live, because they spoke about, I'm treated as an artist here.
One of the things that James Reese, he made a big mistake when he went with the French. He said to them, you know, what's it like to really be in combat? I want to go into no man's land. And he was kind of making a joke about it, but the Frenchmen took him very seriously. No man's land is between the armies. It's the barbed wire, the dead bodies, the craters, and things like that. And so he got the opportunity to go into no man's land. It scared him to death. And he also was later gassed, and while he was gassed, he wrote a song called Uncontrolled in No Man's Land. That was, there's a recording of it you can get with Noble Sissel singing that. And I just bring that up because one of the other things that's really important, it's here, they were the 15th Infantry, New York State, but they became 369th U.S. Infantry, and they were called the Hellfighters because they were the most decorated of all American troops in World War I. 191 won the Croix de Guerre, which is the highest decoration from the French. And unfortunately, in that period, in that time, and you guys, there's the Henry Johnson program here, and he did not get recognition until much later. But in fact, the French allowed the Hellfighters, the 369th, to be the first group to march into Germany after armistice. They were marched in because they wanted to honor them. But the United States asked them not to depict any American soldiers on the pantheon of soldiers who fought in World War I because of the kind of bias and prejudice. And also there was the thought that these soldiers would come back and change America. And in fact, they did come back and change America because they were not willing to put up with the kind of discrimination and the attitudes that they had encountered. And we have this period, what's called the period of the New Negro, a kind of militant, asserting citizenship rights and saying it is time for us to have our full citizenship in this country. James Reese Europe came back. He booked a tour across the country. He was ready to go. I should tell you, very sadly, Vernon Castle died. His plane, he was training pilot. He became a pilot. And so that Irene and Vernon were over. But James Reese Europe still had his band. He came back. He embarked on a tour. He was going to go all across the country. And when he got to Boston, in May, he was laying, the next day he was supposed to lay a wreath at the grave of Robert Gould Shaw from the Civil War. And he got into an argument with a member of his band who stabbed him in the neck and cut his jugular vein. And no one could tell he was really badly injured, so he said to Noble Sissel, I'll see you tomorrow morning at the ceremony. But in fact, he bled to that evening, so that his career was really cut short, and it was 1919. And one of the most interesting things that happens with this is that the very person trying to create the notion of respectability and that we can move forward, he is by a member of his own band. He is murdered, basically. The guy was he was imbalanced. He had come out of a really background where there were issues with him in terms of his learning, and he served his time in jail. He came out many years later and became a drum teacher in Boston, who taught a number of famous artists there. But James Reese Europe had the first, basically, state funeral in New York City, and he was very much beloved, and the whole country mourned him. New York Times did front page articles, and everyone was really sad because they loved him, the connection with the castles, but he was also a war hero. In fact, he had made it through the war and then came back to the United States and died tragically in 1919.
Talk a little bit about Shuffle Along.
Oh, okay. You want to do that? Well, this is what's next.
Oh, yeah, yeah. I love this picture.
Yeah, okay. I'll bring it up.
As a director of a professional jazz orchestra for many years, I actually started that band because of the music of Duke Ellington, because it was the opportunity to perform his music. The music was coming into print. And this picture is really striking. Why don't you tell them exactly what this is?
Okay, well, this is Duke Ellington at the grave of James Reese Europe. I am the chair of the Duke Ellington Center for the Arts in New York City. I work with Mercedes Ellington, who's the granddaughter of Duke Ellington. And we had a conference in 2016, and one of the gentlemen who was there found this photo. You've never seen it before, I'm sure. And it's Duke Ellington basically paying tribute to James Reese Europe.
Yeah, this is just a striking photograph to me because having studied Duke Ellington very intensely, he was not one to give out praise or acknowledgement lightly. And for him to acknowledge James Reese Europe, when I saw this photograph about a week ago, we were sharing material. I was just really struck by that, and him really knowing the importance of Europe. So,
And he had followed, what's interesting is that he and Europe both had the same path. They both came from DC to New York. They both started bands. They had incredible careers. Now, Duke Ellington comes at a time when there's the radio, and so his music is heard and remembered, and he's able to go on for years and years and years, for decades, to write more than 1,000 compositions and to really create the music that becomes the essential American music.
and of course, it's a case of what if. What
Yeah,
if
exactly.
James Reese Europe had not tragically died? You know, I think we would be. I said earlier, I was fortunate enough to have a pretty good musical education, but I never heard of James Reese Europe. And I think if his life was not cut short, we would be talking about him, especially in that era, in the same way that we talk about Fletcher Henderson, and we talk about Duke Ellington, and the great band leaders, and a little later people like Mario Bauza. You know, somebody who had everything in front of him and would have been widely recognized. You know, it's wonderful, but it's also sad in a way that we have to come out here and you know, talk.
Bring him
But this
back.
is why we hope that you're going to go and tell the story, because this is a great American artist who people just need to know about.
Well, he also had a dream, and his dream was he had been in black vaudeville, and he toured shows all across the country. And in the 1890s through 1900, about 1910, African-American plays were on Broadway. But then there was a period where they weren't on Broadway. And so one of his dreams was, when I get back, we're going to put plays back on Broadway again. And he worked with these guys, Noble Sissle, who's standing, and U.B. Blake, who you know, this great ragtime pianist. And they put together a show that they wrote called Shuffle Along. And so we thought we might let you hear one of the songs that came from Shuffle Along, and we're going to ask David to let us hear that one. Okay. So here's the audience quiz right now. So how do you know that song if you know that song? It sounds familiar. There's a guy named Harry Truman, and that was his song. That was a song he used for campaigning. I'm just wild about Harry. It was a love song from a black musical. So that kind of gives you an idea of how our culture is really morphed and connected in ways that are wonderfully imaginative.
So at this point, New York was also, in the same way that Paris had been, New York is becoming kind of the center of the cultural universe. And we have what was known as the Harlem Renaissance. And it created this incubator for all these amazing artists, authors, photographers, painters, musicians. it gave them the opportunity to have kind of a stable situation to do their work in. I'm convinced if it wasn't for that, Duke Ellington would not have risen because he had a stable situation to work in. And again, we go back to the what if. What if James Reese Europe had been there to continue his work? I've made this point before, but I believe we need to say his name along with Duke Ellington, Charles Mingus, Charlie Parker, John Coltrane, George Gershwin, Charles Ives, the great American musicians.
Amen. And so at this time, we'd like to invite questions, and thank you.
Let's give another round of applause for our presenters tonight.
Hey.
And before we conclude, and we're going to actually conclude with a very special final song by David, we do have time for maybe one or two questions. Does anyone have a question? Yeah, in the back.
Michael?
They were musicians who were trained in many, many different areas and traditions. As I said, he'd actually gone to South Africa previously and gotten musicians there because he wanted to get drum sounds, the right kinds of sounds for his music. African American musicians, it's part of the story of ragtime music. The ragtime musicians trained in the church. They trained in bordellos. They learned music in different places. Basically on the road, they were traveling minstrels. Basically, 1893 in the Chicago exhibition, the Chicago World's Fair, is where you have the first coming together, where you start to talk about this notion of ragtime. So these musicians were at varying levels. Scott Joplin actually trained with a German composer, and he also studied at a college where he studied music. So it was very uneven. But in African American culture, the tradition is one of really, ear training is really important and really part of it. Remember, in African performance, everyone is expected to partake. There's not, the notion of sitting in an audience and listening is not part of what comes out of the traditional culture. And so the musicians, and one of the other things you find is that as people were talented, they were then singled out in their community to be trained. So you get Marian Anderson much later being sent by her church to have music lessons. So there was varying levels of the musicians. Sidney Bechet.
Yeah. And I know there were a number of musicians in New Orleans.
Yeah.
I'm not completely sure how many ended up working for James Reese Europe, but there were especially a number of what were known as Creoles of color who were totally classically trained, played in symphony orchestras. Those orchestras, when the culture changed, kind of got disbanded. A lot of those became early jazz musicians, but these were trained classical musicians in the European tradition.
Well, what you find, again, this melding of traditions. You find this really understanding the European form and then combining that with notions of a kind of communal culture. And so in some ways I'm not answering because I think that it's in some ways it's an intuitive answer that they trained in exactly as you said, but then these musicians were exposed to all the other influences that were happening in American music.
And it speaks to his amazing
Genius.
leadership quality to be able to, if you go hear the Chicago Symphony one night and Conductor X is conducting them and Conductor Y is there next week, they can sound like a completely different orchestra. So his abilities as a band leader to get that cohesiveness musically, that cannot be underestimated.
He talked about, I'm sorry, you want to say?
No.
You want me to shut up? Okay.
One last comment.
Okay. Oh, I was going to say, James Reese Europe talked about the fact that his culture taught him his music. He always said that there's something in the culture that really helped shape the way that he approached music. And so there's extensive articles of his talking about that, saying, my music is going to be different from other musicians because I was raised in a community that had a different notion of what music should be.
Thank you. I was just going to say that our panelists will be available in the lobby to answer questions. But we have one last treat for you this evening. And yeah, sure, please.
Is that I noticed that his music is very similar to Scott Joplin's. It has the upbeat and the ragtime feel. And I don't know who came first, whether John Sousa or
Scott Joplin came first. He was born in 1868, right after slavery. Yeah, exactly. And then Sousa, here's his music as well. And then James Eushore.
And
James
the
Eushore-
reinterpretation
Exactly.
of Joplin's music and that kind of.
And that whole period, it becomes Tin Pan Alley, but it becomes
Yeah.
a whole sound that we have another musicologist here, and I'm sure she'll be able to say something later too. So.
Well, if I'd known that, I'd have shut up.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming tonight. We're going to conclude tonight's program with the music, which is all too fitting. Ladies and gentlemen, David Gleason.
So this last thing that I'm going to play for you is called Castle Innovation Tango. It's from 1914 at the height of the work that Europe was doing with the castles. And it's tango. It's an authentic tango with blues cadences, with blues endings. And I'm going to interpret it as is my license as a modern jazz musician, so I'm not going to hold back. I'm going to try to play it in the style of 1914. I'm going to play it in the style of 2018. But so you'll hear the melody, you'll hear improvisation, and you'll hear a little bit of James Reese Europe, and you'll hear a little bit of modern jazz. And I'd like to do this for you to demonstrate the ongoing relevance and the possibilities inherent in James Reese Europe's music that has been basically ignored by jazz musicians who don't interpret this music and make it part of their repertoire. So I'd like to change that tonight by interpreting it.